So welcome everyone to this session hosted by AWID, and we're going to start now. Thank you for joining us from all the different parts of the world today. My name is Leila, and I'm the Constituency Engagement Associate with AWID. And just before we start, I would like to give you a few guidelines how to use the platform, which would help optimize your participation and also gather other participants. Just a quick check, can everyone hear me? Fine? You can type in a plus sign. Okay, great. So first of all, you can see all the participants attending the session in the participant box on the left side. We will be recording the session, so please make sure to always mute your microphone when either the facilitator is speaking or other participants, in order to optimize sound quality. And to unmute your microphone when you want to speak, you can click the talk button in the upper left corner of the screen. Also, we ask you to please keep off your videos because this will slow down the connection at all times. And as I've mentioned, there's a chat box in the left part of the screen, which some of you have already been using. So please feel free to use the chat box to comment, to share your thoughts and ideas, or to have a side conversation with other participants. In case you would like to use the microphone to say something, you can raise your hand by clicking on the hand button. And in this case, one of the facilitators will call on you to speak. Also, if you agree with something, please type in a plus sign in the chat box. If you disagree, you can type a negative sign. And one more thing, you will see on the right-hand side the whiteboard with the presentation. So this is only for the facilitators to use at this time. So we ask you to please do not click on any buttons attached to the right of the chat box. So we also would like to ask you to introduce yourself in the chat box, your name, your country, the organization, if there's one. And I would now like to introduce the moderators. Today we have Marisa, who's the Young Feminist Activism Manager, Khadir, who's the Young Feminist Activism Coordinator, Natalia, who's the Constituency Engagement Manager, and yeah, I've already mentioned myself. So now I will give the mic to my colleague, Khadir.
Hello, hi everyone, and welcome to the e-learning session we have today to discuss multi-generational organizing. Marisa and I, who have been working on this project for a long time, are really excited to be holding a session to have what we consider a very important conversation to women's movements, but also social movements in general. We are going to be presenting in this session part of our work that we have been doing over the past few years around the issue of what is effective multi-generational organizing in women's movements particularly. But before we go into that, I just wanted to pass on the mic to Marisa to introduce the program, and then we can move on from there. But a short introduction of myself before we start. My name is Khadir. I'm based in Toronto, originally coming from Palestine, as I have mentioned in the chat box. I've worked for AWID and the YFA program for the past 6 years, and have been involved in many youth work in the city of Toronto, but also in the Middle Eastern region and North Africa. So now I'll pass on the mic to Marisa.
Hi everyone, I'm Marisa Viana. I am originally from Brazil, but I'm based in New York now. I'm the manager for the Young Feminist program, and I've been with AWID for 2 years now. So I would just like to reiterate what Hajia just said in terms of this being a conversation that is really important for us in moving this work with multinational organizing forward. And I'll just say a few words about the Young Feminist Activism Program. And that's the branch of AWID that supports young feminism activism in its diverse form. And some of our strategy has been this project itself, which is identifying effective ways to organize across generations and what does that look like. Not really having a specific answer, but exploring what makes effective multinational organizing. And another strategy that we use in supporting young feminist feminism activism is making young feminist activism initiatives visible, sort of looking at how young women are shaping, contributing to women's rights movement and to all the inequalities that we fight in our own different contexts, different countries and regions. We also provide support to young feminists to being responsive in terms of really being in touch with what young women are dealing with in their own context, the challenges, and how can we support that. And we have done that through different means. And I think one of the examples being working with Frida, for example, the Young Feminist Fund, in identifying resources that are geared towards supporting young feminism-led initiatives on the ground. And then the second part is really the fourth part is really looking into how do we support the political engagement of young feminists in different spaces, both at the regional and international level, such as advocacy space. And I think now one of the examples is how we are working with young women in the whole process of the International Conference Population Development Reviews, but also the post-2015, which I'm sure some of you have heard about, and how do we make sure that young women's voices and contributions are reflected in these processes, and going forward to make sure that I really like what we are doing, not only what we need as young women, but what we are contributing to change the agenda, to create this world that we want. So those are broadly what we have been working on within the Young Feminist program. And I think Hajia will talk a little bit now about the Young Feminist Wire and the e-learning initiatives that we have been running within the Young Feminist program, and the Wire being our main platform. So I'll let Hajia speak a little bit about that, and then we can move into the constituency engagement team so they can introduce themselves and some of the work they have been doing as well. I'm really happy to be here within the space and looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Marissa. Yeah, just to follow up on what Marissa was explaining about the Wi-Fi program, one of our main strategies, one of the main activities responding to our strategies is the Young Feminist Wire, which I'm sure all of you hopefully are familiar with the Young Feminist Wire and have either visited it or continue to visit it or are a member in some sort of way. But yeah, the Young Feminist Wire grew from just being a platform when we first launched to share young feminist news to now being an interactive community in which young women members have written blogs to us about issues that they've been facing in their own context, but also globally and internationally in presenting analysis. We also do a lot of work on trying to profile young feminist work from around the world, and we've done numerous interviews with innovative young feminist activists who have brought to life amazing initiatives responding to various issues regarding young women's issues. So if you're interested in being profiled or you have a burning issue that you'd love to write about, then contact me at gmalik@awid.org and we can set up something. But as for the e-learning initiatives, the Young Feminist Wire also wanted to engage its membership in not just the news and analysis and online work, but also wanted to bring together a platform where we can have discussions. And the e-learning initiative and the e-session that we're having today is a perfect example for that. So This is the platform to discuss things, and our main topic today is multi-generational organizing. You will see throughout the session that it is heavily focused on discussion and sharing of experiences, so I highly encourage you to speak up and bring to the table the diversity of experiences that you have. So yeah, before we get into the meat of things, I'll just pass it on to the constituency engagement team to give you a brief idea of what membership at AWID constitutes of.
Hi everyone, this is Natalia. I am the Constituency Engagement Manager for AWID, and what that largely means is that we work really closely with our membership to bring new opportunities like this. Part of our work includes working with more than 4,000 members around the world. 579 of those are organizations that are globally based, mostly from the Global South. And one third of our membership is young feminist activists, like many of you. We're really excited to be hosting this conversation with the Young Feminist Activism Program. We feel it's high time for this type of discussions about how to and what are the best practices in relationship to multi-generational organizing. In addition to these type of opportunities through our membership, we also have other opportunities to engage in activism around women's rights, and especially women's rights as it relates to the International Development Agenda. So for example, on September 25th, the General Assembly will be discussing its post-2015, the General Secretary's post-2015 report on new global development agenda, and we will be doing a tweet-a-thon, a tweet kind of mobilization with all of our members around the world to let the UN know that no development agenda can't be held without women's rights. So these are the kinds of activities that we have provided for our members, and we hope that any of you who are not members here will be able to join us. We do provide free membership for young feminists, so if you're interested, at the end of this webinar, we'll send you a link if you're not a member already, although I know many of you are. So thank you again for joining us, and now I'll pass it back to our moderators so that they can continue the discussion. And again, I just want to remind everybody, if you're not using your microphone right now, it's best if you turn it off so that the sound is better quality for everyone, and also because we're recording the webinar. And you'll have lots of opportunities to raise your hand and ask questions later on in the discussion, but for right now, if we can keep our microphones off while the moderators are having discussions, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Natalia. So now that we have introduced ourselves, we would love to get to know you some more. And I can see that people have already started to introduce themselves. But for those who haven't, we're just doing a quick your name, country, city, and work, or any initiative that you're involved in. But I also want to add, if you can explain in 1 or 2 sentences why multi-generational organizing is important to you, or in other words, why was it important for you to attend this session today or to have this discussion today. So if you could all just take a moment to type that out, and then also take a moment to read everyone's introductions and everyone's responses, and I will try to summarize from what I can see here. I can see from the introductions that there are many organizations that we're familiar with, which is great. There's someone from the Center for Communication and Development. There are some PhD students from the Georgian Fund, I think, the Women's Fund in Georgia I saw. And then some people from New York, from the Ellen Fisher Leadership Institute. There's a huge diversity of people coming from different backgrounds. And I think the response to why multi-generational organizing is important seems to have started to come in. yes, one of the most common responses to that question is, about sustaining the movement and keeping the movement fresh and alive. Huda talks about the shaping and building of a solid base to the movement, which is a very important point, and we will be talking more about it as we move into the discussion. And of course, the concept of intersectionality in women's movement, which Supriya has touched upon. That is very interesting. She talks about how her organization is 3 generations working on women's rights for 2 decades and is one of the first in Northeast India. That is really, really interesting. And it is true, we will go into it in more detail, but this idea of multigenerationality or multigenerational organizing is very closely connected to the concept of intersectionality in women's movements, right? Like the bringing together of women of different backgrounds, and this idea of understanding women's experiences in all from all social weights, not just women as gender, but also class and race and ethnicity, ability, etc. So that is very close. Oh, we also have someone from Nazra for Feminist Studies, which the Young Feminist Activist Program has been very involved with. So welcome. I'm trying to skim to see. Stephanie says that it's important to learn from one another, which is again a very important point. The idea of leadership, effective leadership and growth, is another important point that we talk about when we talk about multi-generational movements. That's really. Nilu says that she's new to AWID, but this is her first opportunity to engage. So welcome. I just wanted to welcome her quickly. Yeah, so I'm really happy to see that there's a lot of the arguments that we will be talking about some more and delving into it, into some of these things that you're bringing up much deeper. So this is a very good base for us to start. If there aren't any more burning questions, I can see on my moderator panel that there aren't that many chats going on.
I think there's been a lot of, on the chat box here, just to bring to your attention, there's been some references to multi-generational organizing being important because younger women want to work with older feminists to gain from their experience. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Thanks, Natalia. For sure, learning across generations is really important, and we often talk about this mentorship process of, younger generations learning from older generations, but also older generations learning from younger generations, and this two-way back and forth learning process, or a mentorship model where learning goes both ways, as a very effective way of building movements across generations. So yeah, that's really important. Marissa, is there anything that you see from the comments that you'd like to highlight?
No, I think this is great, and I was just smiling on my own here, thinking that it's really great to hear these inputs, because it falls right with what we'll be talking about, with the categories of why do we think this is important. So hopefully we can get into more of these conversations and discuss in depth of how this can actually happen. How do we take this importance of working effectively across generations to something more concrete of how do we do it?
Yeah, and Nilu talks about, she brings up a really important point about how there is sometimes a disparity in the issues that younger and older generations focus on, right? So she brings up the example of homophobia, which we will get into in more detail later, but that's a very important point, in that there are different issues that different generations are affected by and hence mobilize differently. And then Shaima, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your names, but she also brings up a really good point about developing a young women's movement or a young generation that is full of enthusiasm and has a lot of experience in organizing. So we're just gonna spend 1 or 2 more minutes reading through and also wrapping up. So if you have any last final comments, make them now. Okay, this is awesome. Very interesting responses. I think we're touching on both why multi-generational organizing is important, but also what are the challenges that younger generations are facing, including the generation gap that Nilu just pointed out to, as well as the conflicts and the competition, the negative competition, limited spaces and resources that some of you have also touched upon. So I think this is a good point for us to start talking about, some of our broader categories that we have come up with in terms of why multi-generational organizing is important for women's movements. And this information we sort of put together through our research and our work on the area for the last few years. And the YFA program has not only done work in this area in terms of research and speaking to people, but we have done a lot of this work through our experiences in organizing dialogues and committees and meetings. And the next portion of this discussion, Marissa will take us through the history of our work, as well as some of the research findings that we have come to from this work. So I'll pass it on to Marissa, and please feel free to continue the conversation on chat and continue talking about the issues as we're going along.
Thanks, Hadia. Yeah, this is definitely a great start. And just really interesting to see all the comments and the input. So just to speak briefly about the YFA history of work on multi-generational organizing, what we were interested in was exploring the different dimensions of effective multi-generational organizing as part of AWID's work on strengthening the voice and impact and influence of women's rights movement, and how do we engage with different generations, and from the YFA perspective, really engage with young feminists working within the women's rights movement. A lot of this work started at the 11th International AWID Forum in 2008, which had the theme of the power of movements, and that took place in South Africa. And there was a lot of discussions about, what activists working across generations and ages agree that, the reasons why multi-generational organizing was worth the time, and why is it important to really understand what is the importance of this work. And although there was this very clear agreement that it was important, we didn't really know why is it important, how do we do it. So from there, we had developed a few different sort of phases of looking at this bigger question, why is it important to work effectively across generations. And the first phase of this project was developed with Hadia leading the process with Srilata, which is one of AWID scholar in really helping us think through movement building. And from there, we developed a primer, which is a short document in exploring this question of why is it important to work effectively across generations. The primer provides the basic framing of the initial discussion on this, and we can talk a little bit about it, the different results that came from the primer shortly. And then from taking the primer as a background in terms of answering this question, we decided that that wasn't just enough to do our own research. We really wanted to engage with a broader constituency and in consulting with different actors from different social movements working within the women's rights movement, but also across the different movements. And to do that, we put together a discussion that took place in June with about 35 people, and we collaborated with the Institute of Development Study to have a 4-day discussion that really looked into exploring not only the challenge but the opportunities for effective multi-generational organizing. And what came out of that, it will be one of the things we'll be sharing today, sort of the very elements of what makes multi-generational organizing effective, and what are the challenges that we're dealing with in doing this work. So, and then the third phase, which is you guys are all part of it now, which is really like pushing the process forward, and how to identify concrete ways of working together or taking up these elements that we have identified through the background documents that I mentioned earlier, the e-discussion, and then this webinar itself. How do we incorporate effective multi-generational organizing into our own work in the different projects, and how intentional we need to do this going forward. So so these are broadly the phases that we worked. First, we developed the primer, the document, then we want to consult with our allies and colleagues and our constituency that we really work closely with. And then having this discussion with the AWID members and with the Young Feminist Wire members in looking forward to identify more concrete ways to really see how this effective multi-generational organizing takes place if we adopt some of these elements that we have identified. And then some of the conclusions that we came to was like, why do we care about multi-generational organizing? As we all know, in our movement itself, the women's movement, it's multi-generational in essence. We all come from different ages, from different generations, but doesn't mean that it's effective. So really our prime into looking into this work was like what it makes not just multi-generational organizing, but what makes it effective. And some of the, and then it was actually, sorry, I want to give just an example of that was brought up by a young woman that we were consulting with and referred to as the youth representation. You know, like how do we talk about playing the role of youth representation in international meetings in space? There's the expectation that one person will be able to speak to youth issues, and sometimes only on youth issues because we are young. And then that's the difference between representation and effective participation, and was one of the themes that we really that came up the Young Women's Caucus in 2008, and from there, like continue to explore this idea of participation versus effective and active participation of young women, and how do we work in the different spaces that is multi-generational by nature. And then also in terms of why do we care, is that there's not one specific formula of why of working effectively across generations. It's just like one of the ideas that, you know, like it's going to work in different contexts and different spaces of how do we bring different generations together, how do we talk about some of the issues you all mentioned earlier, sort of the sharing lessons, learning from each other, really working together, and not sort of, oh, you know, we need space because you're young, and you need space because you have the experience as an older feminist. And then the other point that we wanted to make in terms of why do we care is the urgency for self-examination and making sure that we're not replicating the same power dynamics that we oppose in terms of younger generations and the transition in terms of the leadership gap. You know, like the difference between a young woman who's 30 years old and a younger feminist who's just come into the movement now is also really that's a really broad, and there's also challenges from within that same generation between a 20 and a 29-year-old. There's a vast experience and vast opportunities that we can rely on. So it's also a process of critical and self-reflection of how do we take care that we don't replicate the same issues that we have been dealing with in terms of power dynamics within the feminist movement. And in doing this work, we broadly came up with 4 reasons why effective multigenerational organizing is important. And it was really interesting to see earlier because many of you mentioned this, and hopefully we can categorize these ideas that was mentioned earlier into these 4 broad areas, which I'll start by saying the ideological integrity of our movements. And what that means is that practicing what we preach. Some of the work we have been done in the primer, for example, is looking for centuries before feminists had both evolved in sharpen its theological clarity and struggle to bridge the gaps between theory and practices. For example, feminists have grown into maturity by moving beyond gender as a key basis for social exclusion and recognizing that to achieve social justice, there's multiple forms of exclusion based on race, on caste, class, and for this discussion, really look into age and in different generations, but also ability and the different religions and regions, and then sexual orientation. So it's like, how do we deal with we're looking within all of these differences that we come, the multiple forms of exclusions that we deal with. How do we make sure that we are practicing what we preach in terms of our principles of equality and inclusion? And how do we confront these challenges along with gendered exclusion? So really this ideological integrity is looking to these different exclusions and how do we take care so that we don't replicate these dynamics. And then also, I think the idea of understanding the power dynamics across different various diversities, which includes age. And one of we want to share a quote here, which is, came out from our discussion that looks into the differences in age are real. We have not created those differences. What we have created is a oppressive system based on those distinctions. So our experience with the discussion, with developing the primer and the different spaces we have worked in, is really looking that there are very distinct exclusions based on age, and then sometimes when we do bring the age or looking at young women or youth participation, it can be very tokenistic. So how do we really make sure that we're taking care that we're not replicating these forms of oppression? So why is it important for us to work on this is really that we want to protect this idea that we have integrity within the movement, that we as a feminist movement are making sure that we are practicing and analyzing also the breakdown of power dynamics based on these issues we mentioned earlier, which is the from gender to religion to class to age and so on, and looking at different bases of discrimination that activists can experience. And then moving on down to the second aspect of why, a second reason why this work is important, it's also mentioned earlier by many of you, is this idea of enhanced legitimacy and credibility within the movement. Feminists have advanced the notion of intersectionality, or the way in which all aspects and identities of women intersect in the experiences of oppression, which weighs heavily in defining recent strategies for women's rights movements. So if you want to practice truly intersectional and inclusive movement building and more inclusive and nuanced vision of social justice, which we all work for in some way or another, ensuring the meaningful participation of women from different generations, ages, and experiences is really very important. And the failure to do that just widens the gap between the ideology that we embrace as principles of justice, the principles of feminism, and the way we apply it. So we really look into how do we enhance our legitimacy within the movement, but also the credibility. So some other examples is sort of when we are composed of all women, when women, then we can speak of all women. Some of the values we had talked about, as in the case with our integration of race as a dimension to understanding women's experience with violence, for example, economic inequality. Inclusion of women with diverse backgrounds means the expansion of women's movements and constituency base. More women included in our movements directly related to the strengthening of women's movement to tackle and address various issues affecting women. It also means more women included in our movements, also directly related to our force as a collective action, as a collective movement. So looking at this idea of being a broad movement that we work together collectively and very inclusive of all the different experiences that we have, not only looking at the age, but looking at the experiences that we bring in to the movement, despite if you are a young feminist within the category, in between generations, or if you are older feminist with a lot of experiences, a lot of networking, and a lot of history that you bring to the movement. And I think I'll just end this point with just give an example of we worked a lot on that. It's like much harder for governments and donors and other social movements to ignore a larger collective force of that is the women's rights movement, and so much harder to exclude us and the perspectives and the contributions that we bring in. And that way, our movement has a much greater in depth and breadth. We give some, I can share some examples of what we've been talking about. For example, in Mesoamerica, in Latin America, by the multigenerational characters of some of the feminist encuentros that happen every 2 years, and there's a specific group, the movements like the Pepeteras, who bring together in a very specific and intentionally bringing not only women of different regions and issues and ethnicities, but also making sure that's intentional, that they bring diverse ages and generations to the space, and really sort of tap into this idea of different perspectives, different experiences that not only you come with your work, but also that comes with age. And then the third set of this broad reason that we've been exploring of why is it important to work effectively across generations, the strategic value of our movement. Meaningful inclusion of women from different ages, not only the ideological responsibility and importance of the legitimacy, it has also a huge strategic value. And we talked about this earlier in terms of what we bring to the movement and the different experiences that comes from the different experiences that we have, the different ages and the work that we do. Women of varying backgrounds can bring to the table into our movement's agendas of various perspectives and issues affecting them from their own experiences, and this includes generational diversity. This enriches and diversifies our vision, analysis, and strategies. For instance, one of the examples we looked into when we were developing the primer was the case of rural women's movement in South Africa that moved into an entirely new strategy in their work with HIV and AIDS, when they gave a real place and voice to young women working those issues, and they began working with young men on their gender and attitudes and their role in the prevention of HIV. And something that they had not done before, but also something new. And someone mentioned earlier the recognition of new issues for young feminists, so for different generations that are dealing with similar issues, but are coming up with new ideas and new ways of dealing with it. And someone mentioned mentioned homophobia, and I think this example here is also something that's new and voice of young women that has really put that out there. Is like, how do we work, for example, with men in fighting gender-based violence? So these are all sort of new ideas and new ideals that evolved over time. And women of different generations use different strategies of organizing, also, and mobilizing and responding to attacks on women's rights. I think, one of the clear examples, and not to say that it's only young women using it, but the internet has been a huge tool that young women has mobilized and have been using for organizing, movement building, as well as expanding constituency. I would say that the Young Feminist Wire is a really good example of that as well, that we have really looked into how do we use the online platforms to engage and to really be closer to our constituencies that are in so many different places and work in different issues, and as well as using to do advocacy for women's rights. We have many examples, such as the Harass Map in Egypt and Yemen, who are using mobile and social media technology to address street sexual harassment, for example. Young women, similar to Grassroots Women's Collective, led by older women, are also experimenting with reducing or eliminating the need for external funding and finding different ways for self-sustainability in terms of fundraising and mobilizing resources for their own work. So there's just like a lot of new ideas that come with working across different generations, but also looking specifically what are the different generations bringing to the movement. And this idea of strategic value is really important in looking into what is that we all bring into the table, and how do we rely on these new ideas and be really honest about what is it that we can identify as our contribution, and how do we move this forward. And this is the last point in terms of why it is important to work effectively across generation, and why do we care really in this is the resilience and sustainability of our movement. Again, many of you mentioned this idea earlier. Like how do we make sure that the women's movement, the feminist movement is sustainable and it continues to move forward, especially in a time where when we are really dealing with so many backlashes in women's rights at the regional level, at the national level, and more specifically the international level, from the UN to all these global agreements that are going on right now, and more. I feel from my experience and from the work we have been doing within AWID is really being a defensive. So looking at the resilience and sustainability of the movement, it's really important to make sure that our movement continues to be strong and relevant to the issues we are fighting for the rights that we're trying to realize. So our idea within the YFA and within AWID is really to look into how do we work effectively across generations so that we can go back to being a collective force, that we are fighting for these rights, but we also seen as a strong movement that can hold the grounds of the rights that we are fighting to be realized. And I think here I just want to mention one point that I haven't talked about it before, is the generations of women lying between the old and the younger generations, and how strategically positioned, how they are strategically positioned to bridge the gaps and provide connections between the trends of today and the reflections of past experiences. We haven't really paid, I think more and more we talk about younger generations and older generations, but one of the questions that we've been looking at into this initiative of Multigenerational organizes the generations in between, and what is the role in terms of transitioning leadership, but also what are the experiences that these young women or younger generations in between young and old are experiencing, and how are they dealing with the transitioning of different generations. And I think we can talk about more in terms of possibilities of this, working with this in between generations to make sure that the movement continues to be resilient and sustainable going forward. So I'll stop on the the resilience and sustainability now, and I know many of you mentioned it earlier. This is an important aspect of the work, and I think the third phase of this project moving forward is really looking into this, and how do we take our experiences and these elements that we have been identifying as effective multigenerational organizing to build this resilient and sustainable women's movement going forward. And what we want to do next is really going to the discussion session, and really talking to you in terms of what is your reflection, what did you think of these broad reasons, and what are there any other more reasons that we haven't mentioned that you would like to add here. I know we talked about it a little bit earlier on some of why is it important to work across generations and multigenerational organizing in a more effective manner. But here we also wanted to get a sense from you. How did you feel? How these broad categories sit with you in terms of the work that we've been doing? And just to recap some of the categories, the first one is this idea of ideological integrity, and then moving to enhanced legitimacy and credibility, the strategic value of the movement and the different what the different generations bring to the movement itself, and then the last point that I made, which is the resilience and sustainability of our movement as a multigenerational movement and multigenerational organizing. Help us stay relevant and reflecting on the past and continue to build our experiences and introducing new strategies going forward. Yeah, we also encourage you to feel free to think about your own experiences as an activist or advocate for women's rights issues. So what does the effective multigenerational organizing looks like to you and your context and the work that you do, and how do you have experienced this different importance of multigenerational organizing? Sorry, I was going to say, you can also feel free to speak. If you want to comment, you can raise your hand by pressing that, and you can just share your thoughts via the microphone as well.
I just want to pick up on the point that Whitney is bringing up around action, reflection, action model, which I think is a very interesting way of putting it, because it's definitely puts into the equation the idea of coming together and listening and reflecting, which a lot of times, we skip over because of the intensity of the work and the pace of issues coming up and the political economic climate that we live in. But I do agree that there is a very good lesson to be learned from reflecting on how things are doing and if things are working for everyone. But also, when we talk about everyone and what this reflection means, we're also talking about space and who's involved in that space. And when we're talking about space, we're also talking about the power dynamics that are that come up in space, right? Like there's invisible and visible power dynamics, which can be detected and not detected. So one of the things that we talk about when we discuss multi-generational organizing is also, what does the space mean? So when there are, let's say, 10 people in the space, what are the invisible power dynamics that are there? And what are the visible power dynamics that are there? And how do we address that? So part of that reflection, I think, when we come together, is also addressing, is also being aware as feminists of power dynamics and how they manifest, and being able to address these power dynamics in a way to enhance the space and to enhance participation of the people involved in the space. Does anyone have anything more to add to this point? Feel free to also use the voice function if chatting is taking too long. I also recognize that it's difficult to be reading and listening and contributing at the same time and following certain pieces, certain threads of thought. So don't worry if you're feeling overwhelmed. I'm also feeling overwhelmed. But yeah, try to follow as much as possible.
Here, somebody brought up, I think Heather from Texas brought up that there was a lot of organizing around abortion restrictions in Texas, and it was amazing to see the cross-generational organizing. However, there was always a lot of discussion about what tactics were appropriate and a lot of disagreements. I don't know if you want to speak to that in relationship to this conversation. Or Marisa.
Right. I'm just reading the comment right now. Heather, do you want to speak some more to the specific example that you're bringing up? Like, what were the disagreements that were, is it specific to strategies or tactics that were employed, or was it more of a personality clash?
Yeah, Heather, it would be really great to hear a little bit more of like the tactics that were, the disagreements around the tactics, because I think we all experience this in different spaces, especially when it's a huge issue such as abortion restrictions, and how do we fight it? What is the appropriate advocacy or the appropriate strategies to take on? And I think, the experience is that, my experience has been that, sometimes we want to learn from the people who have much more experience and who have been doing this work for a long time, but at the same time, sometimes, we are so caught up in the moment, we are so caught up in the ways that we do things that we think it's really, really work. It is hard to really hear what other people have to contribute. So it'd be really interested to just get a sense from you, what is exactly these tactics that were, what people are saying that were appropriate versus what was not inappropriate.
While we're waiting on that response, I want to bring up some of the points that Kirsty is bringing up in terms of change and, our flexibility to respond to change. And I think that is a common challenge, not to say just for older feminists, but for younger movements as well, who are set in a specific way of thinking or analysis, and then with the constant changing environment, politically, economically, socially, are resistant to some of that change. But yes, I think one of the elements or one of the ingredients, let's say, to effective multi-generational organizing is accepting change as a constant, right? Like, to keep accepting that our movements are changing along with the environment that we're living with, and to not respond to change is perhaps detrimental to the breadth and effectiveness of a movement. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that element of change is very, very important. And Heather says her mic is not working. Have you tried clicking on the talk button? Or maybe you have muted your mic on your computer, because those are two separate things. And I also want to talk about Sharmazm. Sorry if I'm really butchering your name. But I think that's a very, very important point, and something that when we talk about multi-generational organizing, we talk about this deliberate intention to be multi-generational. And what you bring up in terms of space and understanding and carefully bringing, and this goes back to the point that we were talking about earlier that Whitney brought up, is when you come into a space and you're aware of the power dynamics that can be generated or can be brought up, whether invisible or visible, then the way you design the space will also be informed with these ideas. And what you're talking about is in terms of being aware of who is speaking, how much space you're taking up, how much space people are taking up. There's not just something that the moderator or the design or the person convening the space can be aware of, but also the people who are coming into the space as well. Like, one of my biggest things is when I'm in a space, I make sure that I'm not taking up or monopolizing the space. And I think I've heard this from women who are engaging with men in their own experiences, or men who are being involved in spaces where women's issues are being discussed, or it's a women's space. This is one of the practices that are encouraged, that a lot of the times men take up too much space in the way that they're speaking, or in how much information they're engaging with, but that's one of the practices that they use, and I think it's useful when we're putting a space together, especially if it's multi-generational and we're purposefully trying to create an effective space, is to make those dynamics clear.
And just I'll make a point to reiterate, because what Hadia said is really important. It's also the base of this work that we have been doing. Like as we said earlier in our introductions, multigenerational organizing, it happens. Our movement is multigenerational by nature, but really the idea of effective multigenerational organizing, how do we organize effectively across different generations and how we work together, is a very much an intentional aspect of the work. So it's not going to happen if it's not intentional. And I think, this is one of the struggle, because how do we, this aspect of self-examination and self-reflection is to bring back the attention to the intention of working with different generations, recognizing the power dynamics that are there. And because power dynamics are always going to exist, and I think what is important is for us to recognize that they do exist, and how do we address them. And I think the intentionality of the effective multigeneration organizing is really important on this, and for this conversation, for us to think about, how do we do that in our own work, but how do we, it's a very difficult conversation, because how do you bring it up in different spaces in terms of if you are in a meeting, if you are in a advocacy space, or whatever it is. And it's not an easy thing to do, but it's one of the premises that we've been working with. This is really intentional. It just doesn't happen. The multigenerational organizing, yes, it is part of the movement, but the effectiveness of it is really the part is intentional, that we needed to make it happen. And our goal for this initiative was really to identify the elements that make the effective multigenerational organizing. Then we can be more intentional in our efforts to make it happen.
I also want to pick up on an important point that was brought up earlier by Sharm, and also Nilu is bringing it up again. When Sharm first got into the space, she asked everyone if they were young or what age group they are coming from. And as much as we didn't stress that in our introductions, we didn't stress that you mention which age you're coming from. I think, identifying that this is, this is a space where it is multi-generational, means also identifying, which age group you're coming from, or what kind of diversity of generations that we have come from. And Nilu says that, she is middle-aged, 47, and she'd like to benefit from both older and younger women. And some women said that they were, I forget who said they were young, with the definition of being under 30, but they're not new to the movement, which means that, you're wondering whether you are still young in that sense, or if you are in that younger middle age range. And then some people said they were 34, and then I think I saw someone who said they were 25. So I guess, it might be a very sensitive issue to talk about age, or to say that, we're this age or that age, because, but the question is, why is it a sensitive issue to talk about age? And it's because, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about challenges in the next section, but it's because there are stereotypes associated to age, right? And the fear is that when we identify age, we're identifying with those stereotypes. So, it's important, I think, not that I have an answer to how to address this issue of age, but I think it's important to lay that out clearly, that we do recognize that there are stereotypes associated with age, but that it is upon us to understand that these are only stereotypes and not necessarily defining of people. And yeah, I think what Nilu brings up is a very important point about this bridging of generations and talking about multi-generational organizing as not just young versus old, but that there are many diversities between those two. And maybe it's not a spectrum of age, but it's, how when we talk about sexuality, women's rights activists that talk about sexuality try to go away from talking about sexuality as a spectrum from straight to gay, but that it's not just a spectrum, but that it's a diversity that is that goes beyond just being vertical. It's horizontal and broad, and it goes in different directions. So I tend to think about age in a similar way. And Hannah says that the stereotypes are real. And that's a very important point as well, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate some more. Also, please don't be shy. You can click on the talk button at any time.
Another question another question was brought by Jacqueline, which is also very important. She says it would be helpful to hear specific examples of how organizations or individuals are overcoming these power dynamics. And she says efforts to monopolize space in conversations. One example. What are others? So can you guys share examples of how you overcoming these power dynamics within your own work and context, activism, and so on? So how do you deal with the power dynamics within your organizations or your work?
So one example I think that Ashley talks about is nonviolent communication and the step-up, step-back community agreement, which I'm interpreting as if you haven't spoken up, then take up the initiative to step up, and then if you have, then take the initiative to step back. And I guess making that clear that there is nonviolent communication and all people are welcome is part of setting up a space that is safe.
Hi, good day. This is Amy at BSLI, and I just wanted to add that one of the really important things to the nonviolent communication, and both of these techniques are discussed during community agreements that we do at the beginning of our staff coming together as a whole. But a really big part of it is using language that's observational rather than confrontational when you're trying to address issues within a group.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Also, to follow up on the conversation we were having around age, Sharm is also saying that she's 28, but she's been part of the movement for a decade, and that's definitely an experience that I feel the same way. I'm also turning 28, and I've been involved for a decade, but at the same time when I get grouped as a young woman, and I feel that I bring more experiences than my age shows. But at the same time, I guess for me, it's about how I engage in those spaces, and I feel that I'm playing a different role than I did when I first started. But I do agree that sometimes you know, those categories of age can really box us into one space and one role that we play, whereas, you know, the initiatives that we bring into the movement is much bigger than those boxes.
I think there's a lot of interesting points going on now, and some of these are going through like the challenges that we will discuss next. So we can keep this conversation going, but perhaps we can start by looking into the challenges of the challenge that we deal with in terms of effective multi-generational organizing. And then we'll go into most of the oppressive power dynamics and age stereotypes and so on. So Hadia will be leading that session now and looking into the more specific challenges.
Okay, thanks, Marissa. Yeah, as Marissa indicated, I think we are having a very important discussion around what are the challenges of coming into a multi-generational space or organizing across generations. And I think the conversation can continue, and we're not going to be straying away too far away from the points that we have brought up. But just to give a structure for the conversation and to mention some of the things some of the broad categories of challenges that we have come to put together through our research, but also through the e-discussion that we held back in June, I believe. It was a 3-day event, or 4-day event, sorry, where we had we used a platform through our partnership with Eldest Communities Platforms based in the UK. And they provided this e-discussion platform for us to host this event. And we brought, I think, 30 participants from various backgrounds, including various generations and ages, to discuss 4 main questions around this idea of effective multi-generational organizing. And so through this e-discussion, we have put together a short summary of what are the challenges that were discussed in that space. And I just want to go through it just to give some structure to this organization and not to end the discussion in any sort of way, but to prompt it forward as well. So one of our biggest challenges in talking about effective multi-generational organizing, but also trying to understand it, is that effective multi-generational organizing is not seen as a priority issue, despite the fact that women's movements are under a lot of pressure due to the changing political and economic climate to reflect and ensure that it is building a movement that is strong enough to respond to a lot of the challenges that women's rights advocates and women's rights in general are facing. But it is still not seen as a priority issue, and that and it's possibly because that multi-generational organizing is not seen directly linked to the strength of movements. The second reason that was brought up, which was a very important one, and that we touched upon in this conversation early on, is the oppressive power dynamics that are existing within women's movements. And one of the participants at the e-discussion talked about power dynamics. She described it as a deep structure and defined that deep structure as the place under the surface where discrimination, bias, and hierarchies can thrive, right? So I thought that was a very very articulate way of describing what these power dynamics are, right? Because they're not often visible, and even if they are visible, the way they manifest themselves is not always visible. So it is for sure something that happens underneath the surface, where you know, discrimination or biases and hierarchies will show. Power dynamics between and across women of different ages obviously can perpetuate stereotypes or negative competition and false dichotomies across generations, which makes our movement more and more fragmented. And you know, one of the things that was noted by one of our participants at the e-discussion is that the greatest hindrance to effective multi-generational organizing is suspicion, superiority complex, and negative competition. So as much as we like to say that, you know, when we talk about multi-generational organizing, as much as we like to talk about, you know, the power dynamics and the things that are more politically correct, what it boils down to, I think, is the dynamics between people and the relationships that are formed between people. And a lot of that, and sometimes a lot of that is based on suspicion or the creation of negative competition because of you know, the limited resources or space, or as some of you have pointed out, you know, the difficulty of the experiences of women in attaining things or achieving space or achieving various forms of leadership, and having that space to finally give it up and create this this dynamic that is different from the dynamic that they have experienced. So I just wanted to highlight that point as something that is important for us to talk about in terms of what is the negative competition that is apparent within women's movements, and how do we respond to it. And I see on the chat box a lot of excitement, but I'll just focus on the presentation for now. So back to the point around power dynamics is this unwillingness to share power, spaces, or experiences that take place in environments where trust is weak, right? And where the contributions made by different generations are overlooked. So environments that are divisive and unwelcoming alienate women and consequently create gaps in feminist leadership. So one of the other quotes that I found really important in the e-discussion is that age is one of the many social hierarchies and power structures that we must contend with. It is one of the more normalized forms of exclusion and therefore often less visible. So I just wanted to highlight that quote because it's important. It really identifies why age is different from other social hierarchies that we deal with on a regular basis, and that, you know, we don't often talk about age as a form of discrimination or change. Because age isn't something that we're born with; it changes over time, and B, also because it is often less visible than other forms of discrimination because we don't talk about it too much. So moving from oppressive power dynamics to age stereotypes, which we talked about a lot in the chat. And you know, that quote that Marissa talked about earlier, in that distinctions and differences between ages are real. It's just the dynamics that we create around it that are oppressive. So age stereotype is one of the major challenges that we face in multi-generational organizing, and in the e-discussion I think that was highlighted the most. So young women participants indicated that there is this assumption by older feminists that young women are not interested in the work of older women, for example, and that they either don't know or don't understand the history of feminist movements, despite many young women being involved in feminism from their academic avenues or through their activism, or as some of us said, we're still identified as being part of that younger category that is under 30, but we have come with a lot of experiences. And on the other hand, others talked about how established activists find it hard to give the young generation space, opportunity, or freedom to participate, and how this creates gaps in leadership. And then older participants spoke of the stereotype that they're not involved in current issues and trends, that they're not, that they've increasingly become irrelevant, that they are not involved in strategies of younger people, like, being involved on the internet. Other stereotypes are how young people have low commitment and not enough skills or knowledge, and that older people are difficult to work with, they're dominant and bossy. So these are just some of the examples of the age stereotypes that are that have been brought up at the e-discussion. And what was really interesting is that as power dynamics is related to age stereotypes are also related to the next point, which is negative competition in space. So a lot of participants also spoke about how finding ways, how it is really important for us to start finding ways to more effectively share power and to effectively share power and resources. And I think that is one of the strategies that the e-discussion participants talked about earlier as well, was that when we're trying to share resources and space, it is also important to come up with innovative strategies of organizing, right? Like a lot of young women's groups are going back to an older form of organizing that does not rely on funding, despite the, it does not rely on funding, and within that middle generation there was this movement of NGOization of women's movements, and now we're trying to go back to get away from that. So that's one of the strategies that was talked about. Some of the participants also reflected that it was necessary in order to share power and space and resources to value everyone's contributions. That everyone comes in with experiences and stories and lessons and ideas from their own experiences, and all of these experiences together make women's movements richer. Also, they talked about there is a need for youth-friendly ways of transferring knowledge, that a lot of the times, young women in schools are not being educated on women's rights issues, and that it's an opportune moment to mobilize young people into women's movements, but that opportunity is lost. And I think that point was brought up a lot in the discussion. And then, based on that negative competition, there's a lack of trust, and it creates a divisive environment. So when participants were asked about the challenges at the e-discussion, the conversation started right away with the participants saying that the environment of the lack of trust in women's movements is one of the biggest challenges to organizing, and that there is a real need to understand that we all have skills and experiences and ability to learn and make contributions, and that space isn't limited, right? That space is only limited with the parameters that we create. So one of the young women who were participating in the e-discussion was talking about how she created her own space and created her own young women's group because she refused to believe that space is limited, that spaces are only available in the organizations or the initiatives that are already there. So instead of trying to break into those spaces that are already alienating her, what she did was just created her own group and therefore created her own space. And within that space, she said that the challenges weren't, it wasn't that she created her own space and that space was void of any power dynamics. The power dynamics were still there, but at least the space was open to addressing these power dynamics. So I guess in that way, it's like, I thought that example was really important because it not only highlighted that, space is not limited, but it also highlighted that when we create spaces, it doesn't mean that we're creating spaces that are void of any power. That power will still be there, but it's that we need to, it needs to be addressed. And then I guess the other big topic that came up in the discussion was this idea of dichotomies, like false dichotomies or binaries, which every time we talk about multi-generational organizing comes up. Are we talking from young, we're talking about young versus old. Young people are X, Y, and Z, and older people are X, Y, and Z. And we forget about this huge diversity that we have within those categories themselves, but also in between. So one of the biggest topics that came up was this in-between generation and the invisibility of this in-between generation. And what does that mean? Like we've talked a lot about younger and older generations, and despite the fact that these are huge categories that we lump people into, we've never talked about what this in-between generation is, right? So for some women who have, in quotes, aged out of youth-specific spaces after turning 30, they suddenly feel that their contributions are no longer valued and that there are no spaces for them to continue to engage. So as one 38-year-old participant put it, she said, "It seems that you need to die after you become 30 years old and reborn only when you're at 60 to have space in the movement again." And I think that was really pertinent in addressing this young versus old binary, right? Like, once you're 30, that is it. Like, where are the spaces that engage with that generation? And then once you're 60 again, there is a category for you, but before then there isn't. But I also want us to delve deeper into this issue because, as we're seeing now, there's a lot of work being done within that in-between generation age, quote unquote, and we need to talk about what are the dynamics that are present there as well. Let's see. So another quote that was important, I'll just highlight it here, is, "You've missed out on the 30-somethings, 40-somethings, and 50-somethings who can add differently to the dimensions of intergenerational leaderships and movements." So I think that is also an important quote to highlight that, we often say that the role of this in-between generation, or one of the roles that they can play, is bridge the gap between the younger and the older, in the sense that they had that experience of being younger relatively recently, and they've also engaged with that. They've also gathered that experience to identify with some of the feelings or challenges that the older generation is dealing with. So is that something to think about? Is that role also tokenistic for the in-between generation, or is it something that we can actually capitalize on and work with in order to further this multi-generational experience? Yeah, and then back to this idea of strategies, and I think this falls with this idea of false dichotomies, because we touched upon it a little bit, that there is, that issues impact women of different generations differently, and therefore women of different generations seek different strategies in being involved. And I think Heather's example is important because, and she mentioned as well that these strategies, different generations fight about which strategy is will be more effective, but also within that generation there are also differences between how you see different strategies playing out. And from my experience, for example, working with a young women's group in Toronto on addressing Islamophobia and also addressing women's rights within this context of Islamophobia, it is very difficult to talk about one strategy that is going to be more effective or not. And I guess that goes back to this idea of reflecting and action, reflection, action. Is that sometimes you need to take a risk, and sometimes you need to trust certain things, and then when you reflect back on it, you find that that there are different things that you can talk about. And then the last point that I want to talk about in terms of challenges is external factors. So there are obviously external factors like the political instability that is facing the MENA region, for example, right now, that make multi-generational organizing increasingly difficult. And then, of course, funding patterns where there's a lot of focus on specific things, and now I'm seeing a trend in which there are a lot of donors focusing on providing grants and initiatives and funding to youth-based organizing, and whereas 5 years ago there wasn't that focus. And then, of course, this idea of the NGOized context that have impacted the way generations interact with one another. So while this generation is working with an NGOized context for organizing, organizing in the past happened more spontaneously in different forms, and young women are finding different ways of organizing as well. So one quote that I will bring up is, quote, "Nowadays there is a return to the past of an activism that depended on creativity and engagement for more action to be done with less resources. The marches, walks, parades are coming back strongly in the streets." So that, I will stop there for challenges, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss it some more. But before we do, I also just want to point out to some of the opportunities that were brought up for effective multi-generational organizing in the e-discussion. And one of the opportunities that came up was this urgency to self-examine and to understand what deep structure is as a way of really furthering women's movements. We are confronted, I feel that in the discussion it was really obvious that women's rights activists are confronted with this urgent need to assess the state of our movements and organizations and consider the effectiveness or the way we organize to advance our cause, specifically because of the political climate that we're living in. And there's a focus that it is important to build collective power based on generational diversity in order to ensure that we have strong, sustainable movements, but also because of this idea of legitimacy that we're talking about, that if our movement isn't formed of all kinds of women from different backgrounds and generations, then we can't really say that we're speaking for all women. So with self-examination, there was a lot of points that were brought up about understanding what inclusivity means. And I think we touched upon it a little bit. Inviting a young woman to a panel and only asking her to speak on youth issues, for example, does not necessarily mean that we're being inclusive. It's a very tokenistic way of participating and engaging. So instead of doing that, we have to really open up a discussion within women's movements around what is engagement, what is inclusivity, And I'm not sure if any of you have attended the 2008 AWID Forum in South Africa, but that was one of our biggest topics in that forum, in the Young Women's Caucus at least, is what does effective engagement and effective participation really mean? A second opportunity that was brought up was this idea of awareness raising and dialogue, right? So for many women's rights activists, awareness and raising and creating purposeful spaces for intergenerational dialogue have been the main entry points for effective multi-generational organizing. So a lot of people said that actually having conversations about what is multi-generational organizing, like having specific dialogues and specific meetings and e-learnings such as this one, for example, to talk about what is multi-generational organizing increases this awareness of being inclusive of multiple generations. And this awareness helps then be more purposeful in the way we organize across generation. Some participants noted that for awareness raising to be effective, it needs to be coupled with exploration of issues of power, hierarchy, oppression, suspicion, and inclusion, and how they manifest themselves in particular moments and spaces of activism. So I think what I got from this point is that there is a very urgent need to move from a theoretical understanding of what hinders or enables effective multi-generational organizing to being more practical and more effective of putting those lessons into practice. And then the third point is this idea of investing in cross-generation relationships, right? Like more than just raising awareness in spaces, we are talking about relationships themselves. So we need to invest in building relationships across generations. And one of the ways to do that is a two-way mentorship model that we talked about earlier, which provides opportunities for building and investing in a cross-generational relationship. So one participant shared her experience at the Rio +20 conference in contributing with advocates of different generations working with media. So she worked with different generations of women who were working on a specific project, and she said that she had learned a lot from just being in that space and sharing knowledge and appreciating what everyone was bringing to the table. And she described it in this way: allowing open discussion and analysis of the differences in equal conditions, both sides showing ability and potentiality to learn from one another. So I think that was what she loved about the space, was that it was allowing for open discussion, but also that she was investing in that space as coming into that space whole. Another participant shared her experience from the Commission on the Status of Women meeting, and she said that the way she did it was that she had to take the first step in putting herself out there by asking questions and creating a space where she was approachable by others. And then she talked about how she did that, but what she would have expected from others was to reach out to newcomers and make them welcome in the space. So I guess what we're trying to emphasize here is that multi-generational organizing doesn't happen out of nowhere. It happens through relationships, the same way that movements are built through relationships. And so to be aware of the fact that the relationships that you're building are not just relationships that you're building within your own age groups, or that they're not just relationships that you're building because you connect with someone, but to actually put in an effort to go beyond that is part of what creates this effective multi-generational organizing. And then another opportunity was creating safe spaces, which is sort of linked to what we were already talking about, but that we need to understand what are those spaces that we're creating. So one of the quotes that I wanna highlight here is one participant said that groups don't survive forever, but movements do. And because of the transmission and the formation of new paths, and because the ideas are reshaped. So I think that is important, because a friend of mine once said, you know, we're so concerned in women's movements of maintaining an organization, right? Like sustaining an organization and sustaining, you know, the work that this like XYZ organization is doing. But what we should be more concerned about is the movement. And if the organization needs to die, then we should just let that form die, but that the ideas and the cause that we're working for does not have to die with it. That, you know, people, the same way that people are reshaped and reformed and changed, organizations need to be open to that change. And I think we talked about that concept of change earlier in the discussion as well, and how it's a very important element to creating effective multi-generational organizing. Secondly, the other point that was brought up was this building on multi-generational conversations. So in addition to dynamic mentorship that aims at learning in both directions, initiatives such as, I'll just name the one that came up in the e-discussion, was the CREA's multi-generational dialogues. And I'm not sure if any of you have attended these dialogues or who are familiar with the work of CREA, but I think they've done some important work in consistently bringing up multi-generational dialogues as a topic of discussion. Like, let's have a dialogue on how do we talk to each other across generations. There was also an example that came up about the Clock Via Campesina movement in Latin America as an important example of how intentional multi-generational discussions and spaces can be used to develop concrete tools for collaboration and to develop processes for new leadership to emerge. Now, the second point that I want to bring up is this point about producing alternative visions together, which is a very important point. Is that, you know, we were talking in the e-discussion about how all of these are challenges to multi-generational organizing. But what we need to do is not just break it down and say these are the challenges, but also construct together a vision for the alternative that we want to see. And that is exactly the quote that was given by one of our participants, is we need to produce a strong, positive, and constructive vision for the alternative that we want to see. And this was inspired by the indigenous women's movement and their concept of cosmovision as another crucial element in effective multi-generational organizing. So this concept allows us to envision what effective multi-generational organizing looks like together, and addressing the deep structures that was mentioned before. And when we talked about this idea of constructing this vision together, one of the e-discussion participants brought up that in order for us to do that, we need to have a strong commitment to constantly transform personally as well. So there was a huge emphasis on making personal commitments to be the change that you want to see in the world, right? To say that if we want this multi-generational organizing to work, that it's not just a movement issue, that it's an individual issue. So then when people brought that up, we asked the participants, what are the commitments that you are going to make? And some of the examples that was given is, you know, to pay attention to the space that I'm in. You know, one young woman said that she was mentored by an older feminist, and it provided her with a lot of confidence and strength. and that was the confidence and strength that she needed to pass on to the younger generation that she's working with now. So I want to pause here and move into the discussion, and I can see that you are already having this discussion in the chat box. But I want us to focus on two questions. I want you to reflect on, the challenges and opportunities that I shared. Maybe talk about what struck you most about what I had shared. And then the other question is, I want you to share some of successful models that you've seen or experiences that you've had working across generations that were really, really successful, and why they were successful.
Yes, no one's talking. We were trying to allow you guys the time to give us some feedback and maybe raise your hands as well if you want to join the conversation. I know everybody seems to prefer the chat box, so we were allowed, given time for the conversation to continue in the chat box. But I know there are some really interesting issues that have been brought up, including how mentoring can play a crucial role in cross-generational organizing, but it's not the only way. That there's also a fine line between mentoring and trying to develop new leadership. I think there was also a question about effective organizing across intersectionalities, including across races and in classes and sexualities, religions, and abilities. And I think that's an interesting comment as well, because I think it opens up the question of age to other discussions as well. And I think it would be interesting if folks would want to raise their hands, use their microphone to bring up some of these conversations or questions and comments that they have. Yes, and Hadir was being the amazing moderator that she is, and she's been looking at the conversation and trying to think about how to summarize some of these comments that folks are making that are really interesting. And we just want to remind everybody that we are recording the webinar, and we will be providing you with a copy of the chat box as well for some of these great nuggets of information that everybody has contributed.
Yeah, sorry, I was actually trying to summarize some of the points, but then I realized that my mic was on mute. But yeah, I'm really impressed by some of the examples that are given. You know, I think, again, there seems to be this emphasis on being mentored and this mentorship model, which is so important, and it always baffles me, like how a very simple strategy that we've used a lot in the past works and still works, and yet, you know, sometimes it's a very difficult strategy to have. Yeah, and then, you know, there are talks about being available, providing spaces that are intentional and deliberate, of bringing feminists of different generations together. So we can continue this discussion, but I just wanted to move forward to the next slide and quickly give you an idea of what we have, what the YFA has planned for this part of work, for the work on the multi-generational organizing moving forward. So as you've seen, and as Marissa has talked about at the beginning of the discussion, where we had 2 phases of research and then consultations, and this e-learning is part of this consultation. And we're hoping to do more of it in different languages in the future to engage with more membership and constituency of the YFA. But the next steps for the YFA in this work is that I think through all of these conversations we've identified that as much as why multi-generational organizing is important as a topic, the question of why is important, it feels that it's very superficial unless it is backed by, you know, concrete examples of strategies or case studies that have been successful. And that what we really want to find out is, practically speaking, what is it that makes multi-generational organizing effective? And what is it that supports women's movements in working across generations? So exactly these examples that we're talking about right now. Mentorship models are really important, awareness raising, this idea of building personal commitments towards multi-generational organizing. But we want to learn more and more about, concretely speaking, how do we make this possible. So that is our next sort of venture into this work with the YFA program. And we presented a paper at the IDS conference in Sussex, where we had it was a conference talking about patriarchy and you know, the elements of patriarchy, and we thought we would present the multi-generational organizing paper on how you know, these patriarchal elements are being reflected within women's movements through this multi-generational discourse. We're also thinking about having a face-to-face dialogue to talk about multi-generational organizing, but in the few minutes that we have left, we wanted to get a sense from you guys after having listened to some of the research that we've done, is what do you think would be most interesting or most important for you in your work, in your organizations, for the YFA program to do or to focus on in our research to support this multi-generational way of working? So when you think about your own contexts and your own organizations, what is the most important thing that you would like the YFA program to do to support multi-generational work? Okay, so Hannah talks about awareness raising, so we can continue to do these awareness raising initiatives. Huda talks about the lack of young feminist organizing in Tunisia. And yeah, part of the YFA strategies is to support young women, and in that way we're supporting multi-generational organizing. So yeah, we can talk some more about doing regional work. Kirthi talks about facilitation, perhaps get feminists to match the organization they'd like to work with. Whitney talks about the in-between generations. She would like to reach out to the in-between generations to find a way that can be involved. Yep. Ekaterine talks about organizing workshops to talk about multi-generational organizing, which is definitely up our alley. Yeah, the in-between generation is definitely a very important area to be talked about. Yeah. Amazing. Those are really great and helpful suggestions.
I think that this suggestion about highlighting
breaking down
cases of good practices might be an interesting way to explore the conversation as well. You know, a sort of mapping of good practices in multi-generational organizing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We've also, in the e-discussion, we also came up with this idea of documenting stories, right? Like stories of young women or participants who were involved in the e-discussion who've had very positive experiences with multi-generational organizing and why that happened, like on a very individual level. And that was something that I found interesting too. Jacqueline talks about her interest in taking initiative within her own organization to provide workshops. I think that's a very, very good suggestion, and you can always reach out to us to see if we can help.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to cut off the conversation, but we have another webinar coming up after this. Very exciting times here at AWID. And of course, we do want to continue this conversation, so we'll be talking about how we do that with our members through these type of webinars as well, and sharing opportunities that come out of these discussions. But right now, I'm going to give the word to Leila to sort of close us off. And please don't go yet, because we do have a raffle for some books, and that we want to raffle off to the participants of this webinar. and there's some great books. And also we have some instructions for the evaluation, which we really, really hope you all would take seriously and fill out as soon as you're done in this discussion. So Leila, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Natalia, and thank you, Hadir. We just would like to thank you all for joining us today and for this great discussion, for your contribution, sharing your ideas. And if there are any delayed feedback, please feel free to write to us at membership@awid.org or to Hadir. Also, as Natalia mentioned, we really would appreciate if you would fill out the evaluation. This is a link, and it helps us to also even improve our next webinars. And please, this is very important, and we really appreciate your feedback in this. Also, the YFA.org, .awid.org WIRE site has more upcoming activities, and one of them is called Guests on the Wire. So please keep checking their site to see if there's something that we interest you and you would like to sign up. As well, if anyone is interested to write a blog about this experience, the e-learning experience, you can contact Hadir. And as Natalia mentioned, we would like to announce the winner for our raffle for the 2 books called Feminism is for Everybody, Passionate Politics by Bell Hooks. And the second one is Letters from Young Activists, Today's Rebels Speak Out by various authors. And in a random raffle, we came up with a lucky winner, and that is Huda. So congratulations, Huda, for winning these 2 books. And we will be in touch with you about sending them to you. So thank you again, everyone. And yes, please don't forget the evaluation.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Just want to say thank you to Hadir and the YFA program for putting this together for us. They did an amazing job, as you can tell. So let's all just give them a round of applause or a smiley face on our chat box, since we're all very fond of the chat box. So thank you to everyone also for participating. We need everybody to log off of the system so that the other webinar can begin. Thank you.